Reinvention isn't always external. Sometimes it's starting with a quiet voice inside that says, "This story I'm living, it's not mine anymore." You've probably heard these before, like, "I can't change now, I've invested too much," or "Stability means staying put," or even "Doing what I love means starting from ground zero." But what if none of that is actually true? I've told myself versions of these stories too. So have many of my clients. And here's a truth that we've uncovered. These aren't facts, they're stories. Beliefs we've absorbed or repeated for so long, we've stopped questioning them. But what if we did? Hi, I'm Janet Lee. I'm a career development and executive coach. Before this chapter, I spent over a decade in tech, starting with finance and strategy at Apple, then moving into product marketing at Meta, Snap, and a few startups along the way. I've also advised founders, worked in VC, and tried on a few entrepreneurial hats myself in between. But coaching is where I landed, not because I had it all figured out, but because I've always been drawn to the space between who someone is today and who they want to become. Over time, I started to notice a pattern. Before people made bold moves, before they changed jobs, industries, or titles, they had to shift something even more foundational. They had to reimagine how they saw themselves. That meant untangling old thoughts, challenging long-held assumptions, and rewriting the stories they told about what was possible. This podcast is an invitation to do that work, but to do it together and out loud. I'll be honest, I've been putting off this podcast for months. Holding space for others, that comes naturally. But stepping into the spotlight myself, that feels different. So I started asking, what exactly am I afraid of? Here's what I've come to realize. I've always lived between worlds, between performing arts and tech, between structure and freedom, between socioeconomic classes, below poverty and above, between being American and being rooted in something more global. I've never fully belonged to one box, but I learned how to navigate and grow in every room I entered. That ability to adapt got me far. But eventually I started wondering, who am I when I'm not shape-shifting to fit in? I quit Apple with no backup plan. I entered tech because I wanted a foothold in the future. And I spent most of my 20s chasing stability, titles, and the kind of validation that looks good on paper. But the truth, every time I trusted my gut, especially when it didn't make sense, is when I moved closer to who I really was. I didn't always know what was next, but I always knew when something was no longer right. This podcast is part of that same journey, a way to keep following my inner compass, to explore identity, alignment, and choice. Not just for others, but for myself too. We're living in a time of constant change. Careers aren't linear anymore, and stability feels like a moving target. And for many of us, the old ways of working, living, and defining success, they just don't resonate anymore. That's why I wanted to have honest conversations with people who've crossed thresholds, people who've reinvented themselves, and not just about what they did, but how they thought through it, what they feared, what they learned, and even what they're still figuring out. Because meaningful change isn't about execution, it's about identity. So if you're in a season of change, or preparing for one, or looking back on a chapter you've just closed, this podcast is for you. This is a space to explore transitions with curiosity instead of fear, to find comfort in uncertainty, and to remind yourself you're allowed to keep becoming. Thank you so much for being here for this very first episode. I'll be back next week with our first guest, someone who's navigated a powerful pivot of their own and has so much wisdom to share. If something in this episode resonated with you, I'd love it if you subscribed, shared it with a friend, or left a review. It really helps others find the show. And if you're in the middle of your own turning point, just remember, your story isn't over, you're simply turning the page.